There is a moment buried so deep in the past that no human mind can truly hold it, when the world as it existed simply stopped. Not slowly, not over millions of comfortable years, but fast. Geologically, terrifyingly fast. A single day in Earth's long calendar, where the clocks run out for most things alive. Tonight, we're going back to find that day. Before we do, if you're listening to this to fall asleep, that is exactly what this channel is for. So maybe subscribe, and then tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is right now. I mean it, I actually read them. There's something quietly incredible about people in Tokyo at sunrise and people in Toronto at midnight, all listening to the same ancient story at the same moment. Drop your city and your time. It matters. Now close your eyes for a second and try to picture a world with no grass, no flowers, no birds, no mammals. Really not as you'd recognize them. We're talking about 252 million years ago, give or take a few thousand centuries. The Earth looks almost alien. There's one enormous supercontinent called Pangaea, and it stretches nearly from pole to pole, an unbroken landmass surrounded by a single global ocean. And yet, strange as it sounds, this world is full of life. Genuinely, abundantly full. Forests of ferns and strange-scaled trees crowd the river valleys. The seas teem with coral reefs, with shellfish, with fish that have been quietly perfecting themselves for hundreds of millions of years. On land, creatures that look like the distant experimental cousins of mammals and reptiles move through a world that belongs entirely to them. It is lush. It is ancient. It has been running smoothly, more or less, for a very long time, and then something begins, quietly at first, almost imperceptibly. That is the part that makes this story so unsettling. It doesn't start with an explosion you can point to. It starts with a slow build, a pressure accumulating beneath the surface of things, until one terrible threshold is crossed, and roughly 75% of all species on Earth disappear. Some estimates push that number even higher. Marine life, land animals, plants, insects, gone, the largest mass extinction this planet has ever experienced, and it may have delivered its worst damage in what geologists describe as a geological instant, maybe even something closer to a single catastrophic pulse. The question that scientists have spent decades trying to answer is simply how? What force or combination of forces could unravel a world so thoroughly, so quickly? The answer is written in rocks, in ancient ash layers and shifting isotopes, and the fossilized edges of reefs that simply stop. And tonight we're going to read those clues together slowly, carefully, in no particular hurry. Think of time differently as you listen. 1,000 years to Earth is barely a breath. 1,000,000 years, a long afternoon. We have all night. Let's go back to the last quiet moment before everything changed. So, let's go back to that last quiet moment. And I mean really back, not just in years, but in geography, in atmosphere, in the basic shape of the world. 252 million years ago. There is one continent, just one, Pangaea. If you could somehow look down at Earth from space, you wouldn't see the familiar scattered puzzle pieces of modern geography. You'd see one enormous landmass, roughly C-shaped, tilted across the globe from the frozen south to the cold north, surrounded on all sides by a single vast ocean called Panthalassa. And nestled into the curve of that sea, like a smaller sea cradled in Pangaea's arm, was the Tethys Ocean. A warm, shallow inland sea that would have been among the most biologically rich places on the planet. Now, a supercontinent changes everything. It isn't just geography, it's climate physics. When land is spread across multiple continents, the way it is today, the oceans can circulate freely. Cold water from the poles moves toward the equator. Warm water from the tropics spreads north and south, and the whole system acts like a global thermostat, distributing heat and moisture in ways that keep most of the planet habitable. Take that away, smash all the land together. Now the ocean circulation becomes deeply restricted. The interior of the continent, thousands of miles from any coast, receives almost no moderating oceanic influence at all. Temperatures swing wildly between seasons. Rainfall becomes unreliable, even violent along the coasts, while the deep interior bakes and freezes in alternating extremes. Pangaea's heart was almost certainly an arid, wind-blasted wilderness. The supercontinent is, in some ways, a planet quietly working against the very life it carries. And yet life had found its way. On land, the late Permian was dominated by a group of animals you almost certainly haven't heard of, but that matter enormously to you personally. The synapsids, these were not dinosaurs. Dinosaurs hadn't arrived yet. Synapsids were something older and in some ways more interesting. They were the lineage that would eventually produce mammals, which means they were, however distantly, your ancestors. By the late Permian, they had diversified into an extraordinary range of forms. There were the dissident, squat barrel-bodied plant-eaters with a pair of tusks that grazed the land floodplains in enormous numbers. There were the gorgonopsians, sharp-toothed predators with postures and movement styles more agile than the old lumbering reptile stereotype suggests. Some of them may have had early protor, some probably nursed their young. They were running the world, or at least they thought the store were. Alongside them were amphibians, some of them enormous by modern standards, lounging in the shallow river systems that wound through Panga's wetter coastal zones. Early reptiles were there too, smaller and quicker, occupying niches the synapsids hadn't fully claimed. And the forests, though nothing like what you picture when you hear the word forest today, were real and dense in the places where moisture allowed them. No flowering plants yet, no grasses, but vast stands of seed ferns and glossopterid trees, their distinctive tongue-shaped leaves pressing into sediments that would eventually drift apart to rest on 5 separate continents. One of the first clues that all those separated lands were once one. In the seas, the story was equally rich, maybe richer. The tethys and the margins of Panthalassa supported reef ecosystems, built not by the corals we know today, but by organisms called regos and tabulate corals, alongside thick-shelled brachiopods that carpeted the seafloor in such numbers they are still among the most common fossils found in Permian rock. Ammonoids were their coiled shells, elegant and geometrically intricate, moving through the water column with a kind of drifting ancient grace. Fish of many kinds had been refining themselves for hundreds of millions of years, and trilobites, those iconic armored arthropods that had survived nearly every catastrophe the Paleozoic had thrown at them, were still present, though reduced, fading toward the end of a very long chapter. The climate in this world ran on extremes. The coastal monsoons along the Tethys were intense, seasonal floods and droughts that life had learned to work around. But farther inland, conditions were some of the harshest the planet had seen, without a full ice age. What's interesting is that the very late Permian seems to have been in a warming phase, coming out of an earlier period of glaciate. Ion in the southern parts of Panga. Ice sheets that had once locked up significant amounts of water had been retreating for millions of years. Sea levels were adjusting. Shallow continental shelves, those enormously productive coastal zones where sunlight penetrates and nutrients accumulate, were gradually changing. The platform on which all that teeming marine life had built itself was already subtly shifting. And here is the thing about late Permian ecosystems that you might not expect given how much life was there. They were fragile, not obviously not in the way you can see from the outside, but fragile in the way that complexity tends to become fragile. The reef systems, for instance, depended on very specific ranges of ocean temperature and chemistry. The brachiopods and the organisms that built those reefs were what biologists would call calcifiers, creatures that build their shells and structures from calcium carbonate, a process that is exquisitely sensitive to shifts in ocean acidity. The great synapsid herbivores on land depended on specific plant communities, and those plant communities depended on predictable seasonal rainfall. Thread pull any one of those dependencies and you risk unraveling the whole weave. Some researchers think the warnings were already there. In the sediment record just before the main extinction boundary, there are signs of ecological stress that predate the worst of it. Certain fossil groups showed declining diversity in the last few million years of the Permian. Some sections of reef appear to have suffered local collapses before the global disaster. Stable isotope ratios in rocks from this period hint at fluctuating ocean temperatures. Small perturbations that hadn't yet become catastrophic, but suggested a system under strain, like a structure that has begun to crack in places only an expert would notice years before anyone hears the bill. Ingrown, this is the world on the eve of the worst day it would ever know, abundant, diverse, ancient, and quietly, invisibly already leaning toward a threshold it could not yet see. So, how do we actually know any of this? Not the living world we just described, but the precise moment it ended. How do scientists reach into rock that formed 250 million years ago and pull out something as specific as a date or a duration or a chemical signature of catastrophe? That's where the story gets interesting in a different way, because the evidence isn't obvious. You can't just look at a cliff face and see the extinction, but it's there, and once you know what to look for, it's unmistakable. Geologists call it the Paran-Triassic boundary, and in places around the world, it exists as a physical line in the rock, not metaphorically, literally, a layer, sometimes just a few centimeters thick, where the world above and the world below are almost completely different. Below it, the fossils are dense and varied. Brachiopods, ammonoids, corals, the whole crowded Lake Permian community we just visited. Above it, almost nothing. A gap so abrupt and so complete that early geologists found it genuinely difficult to explain. The boundary became one of the most studied geological features on the planet, investigated on nearly every continent in marine sequences and terrestrial ones in rocks that were once deep ocean floor and rocks that were once river deltas and desert basins. Each location tells a slightly different version of the same story. Dating that boundary took decades of increasingly precise work. The technique that gave us the most reliable numbers is radiometric dating, specifically the analysis of zircon crystals. Zircons are tiny minerals that form in volcanic ash and cooling magma, and they do something extraordinarily useful. When they crystallize, they trap uran, inside their structure. From the moment they form, that uranium begins decaying into lead at a rate we can measure with great confidence. So when a volcanic ash layer sits right at the Permian-Triassic boundary, as several do in well-preserved sections in China and elsewhere, those Zer crystals become something close to a geological clock, not a perfect clock. There are uncertainties, error margins that researchers argue about in the literature, but the numbers have converged enough to give us a date that most scientists find reliable. Approximately 251.9 million years ago, within a margin of a few hundred 000 years. A few hundred 000 years sounds like a lot, but in the context of geological time, it's a narrow window. And when you look at the physical signals in the rock, the window appears to narrow even further. The most striking of those signals is what happens to the fossils. In sections where the rock record is continuous and undisturbed, the disappearance of Permian species is not gradual. It doesn't look like a slow fade. It looks like an interruption. Entire communities that had been present for millions of years simply vanish at or very near the boundary layer. Some researchers have argued for a small pulse of extinction slightly before the main boundary, and that debate is still ongoing. But the dominant signal is sudden, the kind of sudden that makes paleontologists do a double take, because most extinction events in the fossil record are messy, drawn out, full of last stragglers and gradual transitions. This one is different. It has the shape of a threshold crossed, not a slope descended. Alongside the fossil disappearance, the sediment itself changes. In marine sections, you often see a shift from carbonate-rich rock, the kind deposited in productive calcium-secreting ecosystems, to dark, fine-grained mudstone that suggests low oxygen and sharply reduced biology, cal activity. In some land-based sections, river channel deposits that were once complex and varied become simpler and more chaotic, a pattern some researchers interpret as the loss of root systems from dying vegetation, which would have destabilized riverbanks and changed how water moved across the landscape. Even the dirt, in a sense, is telling you something died. But perhaps the most powerful signal in the rock is chemical rather than physical. It comes from carbon isotopes. Carbon exists in several forms, and the ratio between them in ancient rock is extraordinarily sensitive to disruptions in how carbon was cycling through the atmosphere, oceans, and living things. At the Permian-Triassic boundary, that ratio takes a sharp, dramatic swing in a direction that tells geochemists something enormous happened to the carbon cycle very quickly. This kind of shift is called a carbon isotope excursion, and it shows up in boundary sections around the world, in rocks that were once deep ocean, shallow reef, river floodplain, all of them recording the same disruption. It is one of the lines of evidence that points most strongly toward a massive and rapid injection of carbon into the atmosphere and oceans, the kind that would drive temperatures up, shift ocean chemistry, and stress biological systems on a global scale. Now here is where the tension enters. When geologists say the extinction was geologically sudden, they mean something very specific. They mean it happened within a window that, in rock terms, is almost too thin to measure cleanly. Some estimates suggest the main pulse of extinction may have unfolded in as little as tens of thousands of years. Others push it shorter. The 24-hour framing you heard in the title of this story is a provocation, a way of expressing just how fast this was by geological standards, where most processes play out across millions of years. Whether the final collapse took a century or a millennium or somewhat longer, the honest answer is that the rocks can only tell us so much before their resolution blurs. What they do tell us with remarkable consistency is this: something happened at a specific moment in time. It happened everywhere at once, from the shallow Tethys to the deep Pacific margins to the floodplains of what is now Russia. And whatever it was, it left a mark so sharp, so clean, and so universal that 250 million years later, you can still find it in a road cut. You can hold a piece of it in your hand, and you're holding the edge of the world before and the world after. The question is, what made that line? And that answer is buried in Siberia. If you follow that trail from the boundary line back into deeper time, the rocks keep pointing you toward the same suspect. Not a single explosion, not a wandering asteroid, but a place high latitude, cold, remote. What is now northern Siberia, it doesn't look like much on a map today. A vast forested region, stray with rivers and marsh, frozen hard for most of the year. But buried beneath those trees and permafrost is one of the strangest and most terrifying features Earth has ever produced. Geologists call it a large igneous province, the Siberian Traps. Traps comes from a Swedish word for stairs, because when this volcanic province is exposed at the surface, it forms step-like cliffs and plateaus. Layer upon layer of ancient lava stacked on top of each other, like a giant frozen staircase. Each step is a separate eruption. Each layer is a moment when the planet bled fire. Flood basalts are not like the volcanoes you're used to seeing in documentaries. They aren't neat cones with lava spilling calmly down the sides. They are what happens when the crust itself cracks open over an enormous area and lets the mantle pour out. Instead of a single vent, you get great curtains of fire, fishes dozens or hundreds of kilometer-long fountains of molten rock spraying tens of meters into the air, and sheets of lava racing across the landscape for days at a time. Most of the time, Earth doesn't do this. It's rare on a scale that's hard to appreciate. In more than 4 billion years, we can count only a handful of truly gigantic flood basalt events. The Deccan Traps in India, associated with the later dinosaur extinction. The Central Atlantic magmatic province involved in another global crisis, and sitting near the very top of the leaderboard in terms of sheer volume and possible impact are the Siberian Traps. How big are we talking? The estimates vary, but even the conservative ones are difficult to picture. Imagine lava covering an area the size of the continental United States. Now imagine not just a thin coating, but flows stacking up to a thickness of several kil in places. Add up all that rock, and you get on the order of a few million cubic kilometers of basalt. Some studies push it higher. That's not a single eruption. That's an entire province of crust converted into volcanic rock, and it didn't happen in an instant. The story written in the Traps is one of pulses. If you could watch Siberia over the critical few million years surrounding the Paran-Triassic boundary, sped up so that thousands of years pass in a heartbeat, it might look something like this: quiet, then a crack opening in the ground, lava roaring out, fanning across lands, flooding valleys, filling in lakes and forests. For a while, the sky turns hazy with ash and gas. Temperatures lurched. Then, over centuries, the eruption rate tapers off. The lava cools. Life at the margins begins to creep back in. Then, another crack opens, the eruptions coming in episodes, some longer, some shorter, separated by lulls that might last tens of thousands of years. Each pulse injects a fresh load of volcanic gases into the atmosphere. Each one perturbs the climate, the chemistry of the oceans, the stability of ecosystems. It's not a single fatal blow. It's repeated shocks to a system already weakened by the last one, and the one before that. When most people think of volcanoes and climate, they think of ash clouds that cool the planet. And there is some of that here. The Siberian Traps would have released staggering quantities of sulfur dioxide and fine particles into the stratosphere during active phases. Those aerosols reflect sunlight, creating short-term cooling maybe for a few years, maybe a decade or two after a major outburst. Winters would have come on harder. Summers dimmed, precipitation patterns jostled around. But the real power of a flood basalt lies in what it does over longer time scales. That's where carbon comes in. Every kilometers of basaltic magma carries dissolved gases, carbon dioxide, water vapor, sulfur compounds, traces of others. When that magma reaches the surface and decompresses, those gases are released. Multiply that by millions of cubic kilometers, and you start to approach the kind of carbon injection needed to explain the dramatic isotope shift we see at the Permian-Triassic boundary. The traps would have worked like a planetary-scale exhaust pipe. With every pulse, enormous amounts of CO2 would have vented into the air, some dissolving into the oceans, some lingering in the oceans, some lingering in the atmosphere for tens or hundreds of thousands of years. Each eruptive phase would have nudged global temperatures higher. The short-term sulfur cooling would eventually wash out of the system. Sulfate aerosols fall back to Earth relatively quickly. The carbon, in contrast, would linger, accumulating from pulse to pulse. This is where climate whiplash becomes a real possibility. Imagine being an organism trying to survive through this time. A generation or two born in, slightly cooler, hazier conditions as a major eruption blankets the sky. Then a century later, the ash is gone. The sulfuric haze has cleared. But now the greenhouse effect is stronger than before. Temperatures rise. Ocean chemistry shifts. You adapt as well as you can. Then another eruptive phase begins, throwing the system in a new direction yet again. Add to that another disturbing twist. The Siberian traps weren't erupting into a chemically neutral world. They were punching through a crust loaded with carbon. Late Permian Siberia sat atop thick sequences of sedimentary rock, coals, organic rich shales, carbonates, dead plants and animals compressed over hundreds of millions of years. When magma doesn't reach the surface, it can still intrude into these layers underground, forcing its way through them, spreading laterally, baking them from below. These underground fingers of magma are called sills and dikes, and in Siberia they are everywhere. When you heat coal or organic shale to magmatic temperatures, you don't just harden it into rock. You cook it. You drive off gases, methane, carbon dioxide, a whole suite of volatile compounds. In effect, the crust itself becomes an additional source of greenhouse gases, amplifying the climate impact beyond what the volcanoes alone would provide. Some researchers have even suggested that this baking of organic-rich sediments could release exotic chlorine-bearing gases capable of damaging the ozone layer, adding yet another layer of stress to life at the surface. The details are still being worked out, and not every scientist agrees on the scale of this effect. But the basic principle that magma intruding into carbon-rich rock can mobilize vast additional stores of carbon is widely accepted. So now the picture grows more complex. You no longer have just a series of lava floods releasing volcanic CO2. You have a deep, magmatic engine infiltrating a carbon recrust, turning ancient fossil carbon into gas, pumping that gas into the air and ocean. The Siberian traps become less like a row of volcanoes and more like a planetary factory for greenhouse emissions, operating intermittently but relentlessly over hundreds of thousands of years. How closely does this factory schedule match the extinction itself? This is where the timing evidence becomes crucial. High-precision dating of the traps, using the same zircon-based techniques that pin down the boundary, suggest that the main phase of Siberian volcanism overlaps strongly with the extinction window. Some studies find that the largest pulses of lava, emplacement and intrusive activity occurred within a few hundred 000 years of the boundary, possibly bracketing it. There are hints that an uptick in eruptive intensity may precede the sharpest extinction pulse, and that magmatic activity continues into the earliest Triassic during the prolonged aftermath. Not every detail lines up perfectly. Different sections of rock, different methods produce slightly different chronologies, and researchers debate the exact sequence in the literature. Some argue for a short, intense main phase of eruptions right at the boundary. Others see a more extended pattern with multiple peaks. But across these disagreements, a broad consensus has emerged. The Siberian traps were not a distant background event. They were active in a big way at the same time life on Earth was collapsing. Does that make them the sole cause of the extinction? Probably not in a simple single trigger sense. The late Permian world was already under strain from long-term climate trends, shifting sea levels, and changes in ocean circulation. The traps sit atop this unstable system, like a heavy hand on a wobbling table, pushing it past a tipping point. What the rocks suggest is not one clean mechanism. Utah cascade. Start with elevated CO2 and other greenhouse gases from volcanism and baked sediments. Temperatures rise. The oceans warm and warm water holds less oxygen. Acidifying seawater begins to dissolve the shells of organisms that build their bodies from calcium carbonate. As oxygen levels drop in the deep oceans, vast areas turn anoxic dead zones on a planetary scale. On land, climate swings between sulfur-induced cool spells and greenhouse heat waves, stressing forests and soils, making fires more frequent and rivers more erratic. Heat, acid, lack of oxygen, different manifestations of the same underlying disturbance. Too much carbon released too fast from too deep a source. In the next parts of this story, we'll follow that disturbance outward. We'll see what happens when the greenhouse gases from a province like the Siberian traps don't just stay in the air, but seep into the sea, into the bones of corals and clams, into the breathing spaces of fish and insects. We'll watch the oceans sour, the deep waters stagnate, and the air itself become a more hostile medium for life. The volcanoes in Siberia lit the fuse. The consequences unfolded across the rest of the planet. At first, the change would have been almost invisible. If you were a reptile sunning yourself on a late Permian floodplain, you wouldn't wake up one morning and say, "The climate is broken." You'd notice smaller things. The cool season not getting quite as cool, nights that used to bring relief staying strangely warm, puddles lingering a little less long after each rain. But beneath those small sensory details, the physics was simple and implacable. More carbon dioxide in the air means more of the planet's heat is trapped. The Siberian traps and their baked sediments weren't just releasing CO2, they were increasing the thickness of the atmosphere's greenhouse blanket. That blanket matters most when it's already warm. In a cold world covered by ice, you can reflect a lot of sunlight back into space. Ice and snow act like mirrors. In the late Permian, though, there was one supercontinent near the equator and very little permanent ice. Most of the sun's energy was already being absorbed by dark rock, soil, and water. Adding extra greenhouse gases to that kind of world is like closing the windows in a greenhouse that's already hot. Climate models run for Permian-like conditions suggest something unsettling. If you start from a warm baseline and then you push CO2 up very quickly, over tens to hundreds of thousands of years instead of millions, you don't just get a gentle warming, you can get strong amplification feedbacks that were quiet before start to wake up. Moisture patterns shift. Vegetation dies back, changing how much sunlight the land absorbs. Dust increases. All of those changes feed back into the temperature. How much did it warm? The reconstructions vary, and scientists argue about the precise numbers, but many lines of evidence point to a sudden step upward in global average temperature around the extinction horizon. Oxygen isotopes in marine carbonates. The ratio of heavy oxygen to light oxygen locked into ancient shells shifts sharply, consistent with the rapid warming of surface and shallow ocean waters. The distribution of fossil plants and animals changes too. Species that were once comfortable closer to the equator appear only at higher latitudes in younger rocks, as if they were tracking their preferred climate zones. Would some studies suggest global mean temperatures may have climbed by 5, 8, even 10 degrees C over a geologically short interval. In daily life, that might not sound like much. A few degrees on a weather forecast. But on a planetary scale, that kind of jump is enormous. It's the difference between an ice age and a greenhouse world, compressed into a fraction of the time such transitions usually take. And the change wouldn't have been evenly spread. Pangaea's interior, the vast heart of the supercontinent, far from the moderating influence of the sea, was already dry and strongly seasonal. As the greenhouse strengthened, that interior likely tipped further toward extremes. Warmer air can hold more moisture, but it doesn't have to share it evenly. In many climate simulations of a CO2-rich Pangaea, the middle of the continent dries out even as the total amount of water cycling through the atmosphere increases. Picture long belts of high pressure settling over the land, pushing storm tracks toward the coasts. Rains that once reached deep into the interior now fall mostly near the margins where warm ocean air meets the land and is forced upward. Coastal regions and nearby seas get drenched by more intense, more frequent storms. River deltas see flooding they haven't known before. At the same time, the inland basins can slip into mega-drought. This isn't completely speculative. The late Permian early Triassic sediment record on land hints at just such shifts. In some regions, soils that once showed signs of regular wetting and plant cover give way to red, featureless deposits formed under arid desert-like conditions. River systems become more erratic, swinging between signs of catastrophic floods and long stretches of low flow. Coal beds, evidence of lush waterlogged vegetation, become rare or vanish altogether in many basins after the boundary. For the animals and plants that had evolved under the old patterns, this new world would have been confusing. Forests, used to a certain rhythm of wet and dry, find their roots reaching for water that no longer comes. Seedlings fail. Old trees die standing, their carcasses adding fuel to wildfires sparked by lightning in the new overheated summers. Herbivores that depended on these forests for shade and food are forced to migrate, if they can, toward shrinking refuges where moisture remains. Heat doesn't just stress life by drying the land, it pushes bodies themselves toward their limits. All animals, from tiny insects to sailback theropods, have core temperature ranges where their chemistry works best. Go too far above those ranges for too long, and proteins begin to misfold, membranes leak, organs strain. Modern experiments with reptiles, amphibians, and fish suggest that as ambient temperatures climb their aerobic scope, the difference between resting and maximum metabolic output shrinks. They can still be active, but they lose the ability to sustain intense effort to flee predators or chase prey effectively. In a suddenly hotter world, more and more days would creep into the danger zone, especially at low elevations and in the tropics, the hours when large animals could move, feed, and reproduce without overheating would narrow. You might see more activity at dawn and dusk, longer periods of enforced lethargy at midday. Some species can adjust their behavior like this, others cannot. Heat waves would have been particularly deadly. A run of unusually hot days or weeks layered on top of an already elevated baseline can push species over their thermal limits. In modern times, such episodes kill corals, bats, birds, and people. In the late Permian, with no refrigeration, no deep shaded forests in many places, and no cultural buffers, heat waves would simply cull the individuals least able to cope over generations. That's selection. But in the middle of a mass extinction, selection can't always keep up, and heat is doubly dangerous in the oceans. Warm water is physically different from cold water. One key difference is how much gas it can hold. The solubility of oxygen in seawater declines as temperature rises. This is a light-forward property of the molecules involved. As water warms, its structure becomes less accommodating to dissolved oxygen, and more of that oxygen escapes back into the atmosphere. That means that as the surface ocean warmed under the enhanced greenhouse, the maximum amount of oxygen available to marine life there went down, even if other factors stayed the same. Add to that another consequence of warming, stronger stratification. Warm water is less dense than cold water. When the upper layers of the ocean heat up, they become more buoyant relative to the cooler, deeper layers. The boundary between them sharpens, making it harder for wind and currents to mix the two. In a well-mixed ocean, oxygen from the surface can be carried down into the depths and nutrients from below can be brought up. In a strongly stratified ocean, the layers begin to live more separate lives. By increasing surface temperatures, the Siberian greenhouse effect was priming the oceans for a crisis. Less oxygen at the top, less mixing to replenish oxygen at depth. The first stage is subtle. Fish and invertebrates find that their old depth ranges become uncomfortable. They move upward or poleward, tracking their thermal and oxygen preferences. We see hints of this in the fossil record. Communities shifting in latitude and depth, species disappearing locally before vanishing entirely. Over time, as we'll see more fully in the next sections, this initial loss of oxygen solubility feeds into larger-scale anexia, vast dead zones in the deep sea. But the groundwork for that is laid here in the warming itself. How do we know any of this actually happened, and isn't just a speculative story wrapped around some lava? The isotopes provide one strong line of evidence. Oxygen isotopes in marine carbonates as mentioned, tend to become lighter as temperatures rise because organisms incorporate relatively more of the lighter isotope oxygen-16 into their shells in warmer water. Across the Permian-Triassic boundary, many well-studied sections show a sharp negative shift in oxygen isotope ratios consistent with a rapid warming signal. There are caveats. Isotopes can be affected by changes in seawater composition, not just temperature. Deoenesis, the alteration of sediments after burial, can blur or distort the original signal. Different locations record different details depending on local conditions. That's why temperature estimates come in ranges, and why papers in the field often argue about whether the spike was closer to 5 degrees or closer to 10. But when you put the isotope data together with the paleogeography, with plant fossils indicating shifts toward drought-tolerant flores, with sedimentological signs of aridification inland and intense weathering along coasts, a consistent picture emerges. The planet warmed quickly relative to its own usual pace. Rainfall patterns reorganized, heat and water stress increased on land and in the sea. To the organisms living through it, the world wouldn't have looked instantly apocalyptic. It would have felt like a tightening, a slow, relentless turning of a knob. Winters not as cold, summers that seemed to go on a little longer each generation, rivers that failed 1 year out of 10, then 2 out of 10, then more, forests that didn't quite recover after each fire. Shallow seas that stayed warm late into the year, their waters growing a little more stagnant, a little less refreshing. For a while, many species could adjust. They shifted their ranges, changed their timing of reproduction, altered their behaviors. The late Permian biosphere was not fragile in an absolute sense. It had survived previous ups and downs. But there is a difference between weathering a gentle swell and riding out a series of steep, fast-rising waves. The first shock of rapid warming didn't kill 3/4 of life on its own. It set the stage. It weakened the ties that held ecosystems together, compressed climate zones, and pushed both land and sea systems closer to thresholds they didn't know they had. With the air growing thicker with carbon and the surface waters of the oceans heating and stratifying, the next blows. Acidification, deep ocean suffocation, poisoned air had a much easier target. The climate had not just changed. It had started to behave in ways that for Permian life no longer made sense. If the first shock was heat, the second came dissolved in every wave. More carbon dioxide in the air doesn't just sit overhead like an invisible blanket. The oceans breathe it in. That's simply how the Earth system works. Wherever air touches water, gas molecules are traded back and forth, shuttling in and out until a balance is reached. In the late Permian, that balance point kept moving. As the Siberian traps poured greenhouse gases into the sky, more and more CO2 began to dissolve into the surface ocean. When carbon dioxide meets water, it doesn't remain CO2 for long. The molecules react, forming carbonic acid. Not enough to make the seas literally acid, in the way we use that word in everyday life, but enough to shift the chemistry in a direction that matters very much if your body plan is built around making a shell. Chemists describe this with a few simple steps. CO2 plus H2O forms carbonic acid. Carbonic acid can lose hydrogen ions to the water around it, and those hydrogen ions are what define acidity. The more hydrogen ions, the lower the pH. And those extra hydrogen ions have a habit of tying up carbonate ions, the tiny building blocks that many marine organisms use to construct shells and skeletons of calcium carbonate. You can think of it like a construction site where the bricks haven't vanished, but they're suddenly locked in a warehouse that's hard to open. The raw materials are there, but much less available. For a fish or a soft-bodied worm, that's inconvenient, but not immediately catastrophic. For organisms that rely on pulling dissolved carbonate out of seawater to build hard parts, corals, many shell-forming plankton, clams, brachiopods, some algae, it's a direct attack on their ability to exist. In the modern ocean, even a small drop in pH can make life harder for these calcifiers. Experiments with current corals and shellfish show growth rates stall or reverse when carbonate ions decline beyond a certain point. In the late Permian, the CO2 pulse we infer from the rocks was not small. It was sustained and likely arrived in bursts matching pulses of Siberian eruptions and the baking of carbon-rich sediments. Geologists can't dip a pH meter into a 252 million-year-old sea, but they can read the consequences from the rocks. One of the clearest signals across the parent-Triassic boundary is what happens to carbonate sediments. Before the crisis, warm, shallow tropical shells were busy places, crowded with organisms that took calcium and carbonate from seawater and turned it into solid limestone. Layer by layer, they built vast reef complexes and carbonate platforms, thick, pale piles of fossil skeletons and chemically precipitated stone. Then, right at the extinction horizon, that factory sputters. In many sections around the world, those thick carbonate successions give way to something very different: thin, patchy limestones or even complete gaps where you'd expect carbonate to be, replaced by darker, muddier deposits rich in clay and organic matter. In some places, the carbonate that does form is unusually fine-grained, more like lime mud that settled directly out of seawater instead of being built up by healthy reef communities. This change has a name in the literature: a carbonate crash. It's CT, what you'd expect if the ocean's chemistry tipped into a state where making and preserving calcium carbonate became much more difficult. Reefs, in particular, seemed to hit a wall. Late Permian sea-supported complex reef systems, built not just by corals, but by sponge-like organisms, calcareous algae, and a variety of other skeleton-building creatures. These reefs weren't identical to modern coral reefs, but they played a similar role. They created three-dimensional structure in the water: ridges, crevices, caves, overhangs, homes. When acidification and warming combined, those builders faltered. Their growth slowed. Their skeletons, once formed, became more vulnerable to dissolving back into the water. If storms intensified, as they likely did in a hotter world, reef frameworks that would once have withstood pounding waves might have crumbled more easily. And when the organisms that knit those frameworks together died, the entire structure could begin to collapse. The fossil record captures this in negative space. After the boundary, for millions of years, there is a striking global reef gap. Complex waves reefs almost vanish from the record, where we do see reef-like structures in early Triassic rocks. They're usually small, low in diversity, and often built by different kinds of organisms than before. Microbial communities, for example, that form thin-layered mats and knobbly build-ups known as microbial light seats. Reef collapse removes more than beauty from an ecosystem. It takes away shelter, hunting grounds, and nurseries. Modern ecologists call reef biodiversity hotspots for a reason. A huge number of species, fish, crustaceans, mollusks, worms, depend on the nooks and crannies of reef structures to hide from predators, lay eggs, graze on algae, or filter food from passing currents. Flatten the habitat, and you don't just lose the builders, you lose the intricate web of life that use them as scaffolding. In the Permian oceans, the loss of reefs would have meant that young fish had fewer safe places to grow. Small invertebrates had fewer places to cling, and countless specialized relationships between species were simply erased. It's like taking a bustling multi-level city and bulldozing it into a featureless parking lot. We can see echoes of this simplification in the kinds of fossils that dominate immediately after the extinction. Paleontologists sometimes refer to the survivors that flourish in these disturbed worlds as disaster taxa. They tend to be species that can tolerate harsh fluctuating conditions, that grow fast, reproduce quickly, and don't require complex habitats or stable food webs. In early Triassic marine sediments, we often find huge numbers of a few hardy forms, certain bivalves that could live in low oxygen, high-stress environments. Simple opportunistic worms, microbial mats that spread across seafloors left barren of larger plants and animals. These are not the hallmarks of a rich, balanced ecosystem. They're the biological equivalent of weeds colonizing a burned field. The chemistry that favored these disaster communities was not driven by acidification alone. The same CO2 that was reshaping ocean carbonate balance was also warming the water, as we've seen, and changing how nutrients cycle through the sea. Warmer surface waters hold less oxygen and mix less effectively with the depths. At the same time, stressed, dying ecosystems can dump large amounts of organic matter into the water column. Every dead plankton cell, every falling fragment of a once living reef becomes food for bacteria. As microbes consume that rain of organic debris, they use up oxygen in the surrounding water. If acidification is the blow to calcifier's ability to build, warming is the hand that pushes the ocean toward breathlessness together. They alter not just who can grow, but who can breathe. Food webs feel this from the bottom up. Many shell-forming plankton are primary producers or grazers at the base of marine food chains. If their populations crash because their shells don't form properly, or because young stages dissolve before maturing, the energy supply that sustains higher trophic levels becomes unstable. Fish that relied on them must switch diets, migrate or die. Predators that fed on those fish in turn face scarcity. In the late Permian seas, this would not have happened everywhere at once, or in exactly the same way. Some basins may have remained relatively buffered, at least for a while, by local circulation patterns or by fresh influxes of alkalinity from weathering on land. Others, especially restricted shelves and epicontinental seas, may have crossed critical thresholds quickly, seeing rapid acidification, warming, and oxygen loss all layered together. The sedimentary record again gives us clues to this patchwork. In some places, carbonate deposition recovers briefly after the boundary, then fails again. In others, we see thick accumulations of those microbialites, suggesting that microbial communities seeped into ecological space vacated by more complex reef builders. Dark laminated shells, rich in organic matter, begin to appear more frequently, hinting that parts of the seafloor were no longer receiving enough oxygen to support burrowing animals that usually churn and mix sediments. Each of these lines of evidence, carbonate crashes, reef gaps, disaster taxa, organic-rich shales, points toward oceans that were becoming not just warmer, but chemically and biologically unfamiliar to the organisms that had evolved in them. It's important to remember that none of these stresses acted in isolation. A brachipod sitting on a Paran seafloor didn't experience acidification one day, decade warming the next, and oxygen loss sometime later. It experienced water that was a little more corrosive to its shell, a little hotter than its enzymes preferred, a little poorer in oxygen than its ancestors had known. Perhaps food arrived less reliably because the plankton above was struggling. Perhaps its larvae drifted into waters where their first attempts at building tiny shells failed. Push all of those marginal disadvantages together, and the line between surviving and vanishing becomes very thin. By the time reefs had largely collapsed and carbonate factories had gone mostly quiet, the stage was set for an even deeper transformation of the seas. With stratification increasing and organic decay accelerating, vast regions of the ocean interior were slipping toward a state where oxygen would become a rare commodity. Up to this point, life in the late Paran oceans had been dealing with a hostile chemistry and a fever. Next, it would have to face something more absolute. The slow expanding suffocation of the deep. Oceans don't just get bad, they fail in particular ways. One of the most important words for what happened next is short and quietly terrifying. Anoxia, literally without oxygen. Most of the time modern oceans are only hypoxic in special places. A few deep basins, some stagnant fjords, narrow pockets where circulation is weak and nutrient runoff is high. Fish avoid those zones if they can. Bottom dwellers disappear from them. But for the most part, the open ocean stays breathable, at least for creatures adapted to life in water. In the late Permian, that balance began to tip. The process starts at the surface. Warm water is light water. As the atmosphere pours heat into the top skin of the ocean, that skin expands and floats a little higher above the cold, dense water below. You can think of it as a thermal lid. The stronger the temperature difference between surface and depth, the harder it becomes for winds and currents to mix the two. Under normal conditions, storms, tides, and large-scale circulation constantly stir the ocean, dragging oxygen-rich surface water downward and bringing up cooler, nutrient-rich water from below. This slow churning is how the deep sea breathes. Now imagine that lid getting thicker and more stubborn with each increment of warming. The top few tens of meters stay in frequent contact with the air. They can still take in oxygen from waves and wind, but below the mixing layer, the water begins to go quiet. Each year, particles of dead plankton, fecal pellets, and fragments of once living reef snow down through that stillness. Bacteria follow the food, and as they break it down, they strip oxygen from the surrounding water. If enough organic matter sinks, and if the deep water is cut off from regular refreshment from above, the result is simple. Oxygen drops, first by a little, then by a lot. Eventually, in some depths, it can reach essentially zero. That's anoxia. To a fish, a worm, a clam, oxygen is not an abstract chemical. It's the difference between metabolism and shutdown. Even modest reductions in dissolved oxygen can stress many marine animals, forcing them to move, slow their growth, or change their behavior. When oxygen vanishes entirely, most complex creatures simply cannot function. Their respiratory pigments cannot grab what is not there. How do we know that this happened on a large scale in oceans that vanished more than 250 million years ago? We read the sediments they left behind in a well-oxygenated seafloor. Mud is busy. Burrowing animals churn through it, mixing layers, making little tunnels and tracks. Their activity leaves behind a mottled, disturbed texture that geologists can recognize tens of millions of years later. Organic matter that reaches such a bottom is usual. Lie broken down quickly. Little of it is preserved. But when the water just above the seafloor loses its oxygen, the ecosystem goes quiet. Burrowers die or flee. Bacteria that can work without oxygen take over, and the mud accumulates in fine, undisturbed layers. Organic material is not fully decomposed, so more of it is locked into the sediment. The result is a very distinctive rock, dark, thinly laminated, often rich in organic carbon. When exposed on cliffs or in drill cores, these layers can be nearly black. Across many parts of the world, rocks that were laid down around the Permian-Triassic boundary show exactly this kind of black laminated shale. They appear in deep basins and on continental margins in what were once wide epicontinental seas. In some successions, they form thick packages that persist for tens or even hundreds of thousands of years after the extinction peak. Within those black shells, we find other clues. Tiny crystals of iron sulfide, pyrite, often occur in unusually high amounts. Pyrite can form in many ways, but one common pathway involves bacteria that live without oxygen, using sulfate instead of O2 in their metabolic chemistry. They take in sulfate, combine it with iron, and leave behind pyrite grains. Elevated abundance of such grains, especially certain flamboyant raspberry-like forms, is often interpreted as a sign that seafloor sediments formed under low oxygen or in oxic waters. Chemical signatures add to the picture. Certain trace metals such as molybdenum, uranium, and vanadium become more concentrated in sediments when the water overlying them is anoxic. These elements behave differently in oxygen, poor conditions, tending to be scavenged from the water column and fixed into the mud. At the Permian-Triassic boundary, many sections show spikes in these metals, precisely where the black shells appear. None of these lines of evidence on their own would be conclusive. Together arranged layer by layer in rocks from multiple continents, they point toward a world ocean that was increasingly starved of oxygen, and the suffocation did not stay politely in the deep. Most marine life then, as now, thrived on continental shelves, those broad, relatively shallow zones that fringe the edges of continents. Sunlight can reach the bottom across much of a shelf. Nutrients wash in from land. Reef seagrass beds and thick communities of soft bottom dwellers turn these areas into rich biological factories. They also sit directly above the sloping margins, where deep, potentially anoxic waters can creep upward if circulation patterns change. As stratification intensified and more of the deep ocean turned into a stagnant, oxygen-poor reservoir, that boundary between breathing and breathless water could migrate up slopes onto shelves into places that had been, for millions of years, comfortably aerated. The transition would not necessarily have been a sharp line. Imagine, instead, a broad fluctuating zone where oxygen levels were often low and occasionally dropped near zero. Many shelf communities are adapted to some variability. They experience storms, river floods, and seasonal changes, but there are limits, cross certain thresholds for too long, and animals that can't move simply perish. There is another layer to the story, one that adds not just absence of oxygen, but the presence of something actively toxic. In some of the most extreme and oxic environments on Earth today, like parts of the Black Sea, the oxygen-free waters are not just inert. They are charged with dissolved hydrogen sulfide, a gas produced by certain bacteria that thrive where oxygen is absent but sulfate is plentiful. This combination of anoxia and abundant sulfide is called eukysenia. Hydrogen sulfide is dangerous stuff. It can interfere with cellular respiration even in animals that are otherwise healthy. High enough concentrations can be lethal to fish, invertebrates, and if it reaches the air in large quantities, even to terrestrial animals breathing above the water. Some researchers think that parts of the late Permian and early Triassic Ocean became not just anoxic, but broadly enic, especially in mid-depth and deeper layers. Indicative chemical signals in the rocks, including particular sulfur isotope patterns and certain organic biomarkers associated with green sulfur bacteria, are often cited as support for this idea. Those bacteria live where light still penetrates, but oxygen does not. Feeding on hydrogen sulfide, their presence hints at a water column in which sulfide-rich layers may have encroached into zones that still received sunlight. If such sulfide-charged water masses welled up onto continental shelves, the effect on marine life could have been severe and rapid. Not a slow metabolic struggle against low oxygen, but sudden episodes of outright poisoning. Even without invoking the most extreme version of this scenario, the biological impacts of expanding anoxia are clear in the fossils. Many groups that had flourished in well-oxygenated late Permian seas suffered heavily. Complex reef-building communities, active swimming predators, animals that needed high stable oxygen levels for their lifestyles. These tend to decline or vanish in sections that show evidence for widespread oxygen loss. Yet life did not disappear entirely. It reorganized. The survivors that do well in these post-extinction oceans share a few key traits. They're often small-bodied. They tend to have relatively simple metabolisms. Many can tolerate wide swings in environmental conditions, changes in temperature, salinity, and importantly, oxygen. Some by valves, for example, can survive in waters that would suffocate many fish. They may switch to low-oxygen metabolic pathways, close their shells for extended periods, or live partially buried in sediments, where small chemical gradients can be exploited. Certain worms and crustaceans can move vertically in the sediment, following the thin layer where just enough oxygen seeps down from above. Microbial mats thrive on seafloors, where grazing animals are scarce. Opportunistic plankton species, those that reproduce quickly and do not rely on building thick shells, can take advantage of nutrient-rich but physically stressful waters. This selective survival reshapes ecosystems from the bottom up. Food webs become shorter, simpler, more dominated by a few hardy generalist species. The graceful specialized niches of the Permian large reef-dwelling fish, ornate brachiopods adapted to precise flow conditions. Intricate symbioses are replaced, at least for a time, by a more uniform cast of tough, adaptable organisms. From the perspective of the extinction event, that toughness matters in another way. Systems under chronic stress can absorb quite a bit of damage before they suddenly transition into a new state. For a long time, oxygen might be low, but not zero. Sulfide sporadic, rather than persistent. Shelf communities, battered but not eradicated. Then when key thresholds are crossed, when warming, nutrient loading, and circulation changes push a basin past a tipping point, the spread of anoxia can accelerate. Once deep waters are severely oxygen depleted, any further increase in organic decay or further reduction in mixing makes it easier for an oxia to expand upward and outward. At that stage, the ocean is not just vulnerable, it is primed. In such a primed system, relatively short-lived triggers, a pulse of warmth, a surge of nutrient runoff from a floodplain scorched by volcanic activity, a temporary change in wind patterns can drive rapid, perhaps geologically instantaneous expansions of dead zones across continental shelves. This is what makes anoxia, and especially its more toxic cousin, euxenia, a serious candidate for a true kill mechanism in the Anarian crisis, a process that could operate at planetary scale and that, once certain conditions were met, might deliver much of its damage over intervals that in the fossil record look almost abrupt. By the time those black shells were thickening across ocean basins, the Permian world had already been weakened by heat and acidification. Now large parts of its seas were losing their ability to sustain breath itself. The stage was set for the disaster to leap from water into air as the same volcanic engine that poisoned the oceans began to alter the very sky above the continents. On land, there is no black shale to quietly record the disaster. There is only air, soil, and things that either go on living or stop. The same Siberian eruptions that warmed the climate and choked the oceans were also pumping vast amounts of gas straight into the atmosphere. Not just carbon dioxide, but a whole cocktail of other compounds. Sulfur, chlorine, fluorine. Things that don't just trap heat, but change the chemistry of the sky itself. Start with sulfur. When sulfur-rich magma meets groundwater or surface water, it can release sulfur dioxide in enormous quantities. In the high atmosphere, sulfur dioxide reacts with water vapor to form tiny droplets of sulfuric acid. These aerosols can reflect sunlight and for a while cool the planet's surface even as long-term greenhouse gases are ratcheting temperatures upward. That might sound like a relief, but it's a complicated bargain. Those same sulfur compounds eventually come back down as acid deposition. Rain, fog, even dry dust carrying acid to the ground. Acid rain is not like a Hollywood shower that melts forests overnight. It is quieter and more insidious. It seeps into soils, leaching out essential nutrients like calcium and magnesium, mobilizing metals like aluminum in ways that can poison plant roots. It lowers the pH of lakes and streams, stressing freshwater life. It can weaken trees over years, making them more vulnerable to drought, disease, and frost. Now, imagine this not as a regional industrial problem like modern acid rain episodes, but as a planetary-scale multi-000-year phenomenon, renewed again and again by fresh pulses of volcanic gas, a background drizzle of acidity waxing and waning with each eruptive surge. Some geochemical signatures from parent Triassic boundary rocks, particular patterns in sulfur isotopes, shifts in certain weathering indicators are consistent with intensified acid weathering on land. They don't give us a movie of each rainfall, but they suggest that continental surfaces were being chemically scoured. Plants anchor themselves in those surfaces. Lake Perrin landscapes were not bare. They were home to sprawling forests of conifers and seed ferns, thick undergrowth, swampy wetlands. Deep-rooted plants help bind soil, cycle nutrients, keep local climates more humid. Strip them away and the ground itself becomes unstable. How do you strip them away on a continental scale? Heat helps, drought helps, acid rain helps, and there may have been another, more subtle attack coming from above. Damage to the ozone layer. Modern industrial chemicals, chlorofluorocarbons, taught us something uncomfortable in the late 20th century. Thin, the protective layer of ozone high in the stratosphere, and more ultraviolet B radiation from the sun reaches the surface. That extra UVB doesn't heat the air much, but it beats directly on living tissues. It can damage DNA, impair photosynthesis, injure plant leaves and spores. The Siberian traps did not emit chlorofluorocarbons, but they did likely emit huge amounts of halogens. Chlorine and fluorine-bearing gases released both from the magma itself and from sedimentary rocks baked and boiled by intruding magma sheets. Some modeling studies suggest that repeated injections of such halogens into the stratosphere could have chewed away at ozone over large regions at least temporarily. The evidence for late Permian ozone depletion is not as direct as we might like. Ozone itself doesn't fossilize, but some plant microcells, pollen and spores from around the boundary show high rates of deformities, abnormal shapes, wall damage, irregular development. In modern experiments, elevated UVB exposure can produce just such malformations. This has led some researchers to propose that during certain pulses of the crisis, continental plants were being bathed in unusually harsh, ultraviolet light. It's important to be cautious here. Deformed spores could have more than one cause. Toxic metals, temperature extremes, and other stresses also affect development. Ozone depletion during the Nerian is still a hypothesis, not a settled fact, but if it happened, even intermittently, it would add another layer of difficulty to an already strained terrestrial biosphere. Picture the cumulative effect. Year after year, the climate beats hotter. Rainfall becomes erratic, drenching downpours one season, then long, fierce, dry spells. When rain does fall, it carries more acid than before, nibbling at leaf surfaces, gnawing away at soil structure. In the background, perhaps impulses tied to especially intense eruptive phases. The upper atmosphere occasionally thins its ultraviolet shield, letting more UVB spear down onto already stressed forests. Plants can adapt to many things, but they do best when stresses come one at a time, or slowly enough for evolution to keep pace. In the late Permian, those stresses stacked. Heat, drought, acidity, maybe ultraviolet spikes. Different regions would have responded in different ways, but across the supercontinent, the signal in the rocks is that terrestrial vegetation took a major hit. One line of evidence comes from charcoal. Charcoal is fossilized fire. When plant matter burns hot enough and fast enough, it can leave behind blackened carbon-rich fragments. Those fragments can be washed into lakes, rivers, and shallow seas, becoming part of the sedimentary record. Across many Permian-Triassic boundary sections, there is an increase in charcoal abundance. In some places, there are distinct layers rich in charcoal grains, suggesting intervals when wildfire was widespread. Charcoal chemistry and microscopic structure indicate that a range of plant types burned, including woody tissues. Wildfires need three things: fuel, ignition, and the right atmospheric conditions. Fuel, in this case, was drying vegetation. Ignition would often have come from lightning. A warmer world with stronger evaporation can support more vigorous convective storms in certain regions. More storm energy can mean more lightning strikes. As plant cover thinned and forest became patchier, some areas may have seen less fire, simply because there was less to burn. But during transitional phases, when vegetation was still abundant enough to provide fuel, yet stressed and dried by heat and erratic rain, the stage would have been set for extremely intense fires. Crown fires racing through conifer forests, surface fires scouring shrublands, peat fires smoldering in drying wetlands. The atmosphere itself may have been more fire-friendly too. Higher oxygen levels make fires easier to start and more vigorous once ignited, while lower levels suppress them. Late Permian oxygen was probably somewhat lower than today, not higher. So we don't invoke a hyperflammable world. Even so, under hot, dry conditions, ordinary oxygen levels are more than enough. The charcoal tells us that flames moved across landscapes. The sediments that sandwich those charcoal-rich layers tell us what came after. When vegetation is removed by fire, drought, or broad mortality, soils are exposed. Roots that once held them together decay. Without a canopy to soften raindrops and slow runoff, intense storms can strip loose material from hillslopes and floodplains. That sediment doesn't vanish. It washes downhill, gathering into streams and rivers, bearing organic matter and nutrients with it. At the Permian-Triassic boundary, many continental and nearshore marine rocks show signs of increased erosion. Coarser sediments, abrupt pulses of sand and silt overlying finer, calmer deposits. Geochemists see spikes in certain elements associated with fresh weathering and nutrient delivery. These are precisely the kinds of inputs that, when they reach coastal waters, can fertilize plankton blooms, and by doing so help drive further inoxia and akinia. Land and sea were not experiencing separate disasters. They were parts of the same coupled system. Forests died back. Soils slipped away. Rivers carried that material into already stressed coastal seas. Coastal seas lost more oxygen. Marine ecosystems crashed, releasing still more organic decay products into the water column. Feedback loops, once they started, were hard to stop. On land, the collapse of plant communities did something else. It pulled the floor out from under herbivores. Permian landscape supported diverse plant-eating animals. Large tusked dicynodonts, a group of synapsids closer to mammals than to reptiles. Stocky barrel-bodied forms, browsers with beaks and grinders adapted to tough foliage. Alongside them, smaller herbivores nibbled, grazed and burrowed. These animals were not just eating leaves. They were living on a web of particular plant species in particular places, tied to specific moisture regimes and soil types. As forests and wetlands frayed, that web broke. Some herbivores may have retreated to refuse, valleys that stayed wetter, uplands that caught more rain. Others may have tried to shift diets. Generalists likely fared better than picky specialists, but the fossil record across many regions shows a decline in large terrestrial herbivores around the boundary. Diversity drops, body sizes tend to shrink, whole lineages disappear. Whole lineages disappear. Predators feel that immediately. Big carnivores can endure short-term prey, shortages by ranging farther, hunting different species, scavenging more. But when the base of the food pyramid is fundamentally reduced, when forests thin, herbivore biomass collapses. Apex predators have nowhere to climb down to. Late Permian ecosystems supported formidable hunters, saber-toothed gorgonopsians, early Erosaur relatives. Most did not make it into the Triassic. This is how extinction cascades. Plants falter under combined assaults from climate, chemistry, and perhaps ultraviolet stress. Herbivores lose their food base. Predators lose their prey. Diatrorors briefly enjoy a flush of dead material, then decline as the flow of new productivity dwindles. Each step in the chain amplifies the losses of the step below. What would it have felt like to stand in such a world? Imagine a night on the interior of Pangaea near the height of the crisis. The air is warm, not the gentle warmth of a summer evening, but a heavy lingering heat that does not quite let go after sunset. The day's haze has thinned, but the sky is still not fully clear. Faint bands of smoke drift high above, catching starlight in a diffuse, dirty glow. The forest around you is not silent, but it is quieter than it should be. Insects still rasp and click. Somewhere a small nocturnal animal moves through the undergrowth, but the ambient chorus of life, the calls of many kinds of amphibians, the rustles of large browsing animals, the distant bellows of predators, is muted. Gaps open in the canopy where old trees have died and not yet been replaced. Underfoot, the soil is dusty in some spots, crusted and oddly slick in others, where recent acidic rains have hardened the surface. Now and then, heat lightning flickers on a far horizon. There is no booming thunder, just pale, silent flashes that briefly silhouette the ragged tree. You can smell something faint in the air, a ghost of burned resin and char that never quite goes away, even on nights between fires. The crisis did not feel like a single apocalyptic day to the creatures living through it. It felt like a long series of uneasy seasons, forests thinning, streams turning muddier after each storm, food sources appearing and vanishing unpredictably, the rare years of apparent respite when rains came on time, and fires were few, followed by new surges of heat and ash on the wind. From our distance, looking at rocks and fossils, we compressed this drawn-out struggle into a boundary line, a sharp contact between the before and the after. But that line was written by countless individual days and nights, like this one, in which the air itself had changed, in which each breath, each sprouting seed, each newborn animal was a small wager against an atmosphere and a landscape that were gradually turning against them. As Pangaea's continents baked and burned, and as their soils bled into the seas, the stage was being set for something geologically abrupt. For intervals when all of these slow stresses would converge and the biosphere already weakened would experience losses that in hindsight look almost instantaneous. The planet had accumulated its poisons. All it needed now was a handful of critical pushes to deliver them. From the vantage point of a single animal, the Marian crisis was a long fatigue, years of bad seasons, uneasy recoveries, and then worse seasons still. From the vantage point of the rocks, it can look like a cliff. This is where the idea of 24 hours comes from. Not that an entire global ecosystem literally collapsed between one sunrise and the next, but that, in geological terms, the final plunge was so abrupt that it might as well have been a single terrible day. To make sense of that, it helps to understand how slow disses can end fast. Geologists use the word sudden differently than we use it in ordinary life. For us, sudden means a lightning strike, a falling tree, a glass shattering on the floor, a second, a minute, maybe an hour. For the Earth, sudden can mean 1,000 years, 10,000, sometimes even more. If a process normally takes millions of years and it finishes in a few tens of thousands, that's a jolt, that's abrupt, that's a step change. The end Permian extinction unfolds over a window of time that, depending on the section and the method, is measured in tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. Within that window there seem to have been pulses, intervals when conditions worsened sharply, losses spiked, and ecosystems crossed thresholds they could not come back from. From our human perspective, that's still vastly longer than a day. From the perspective of the fossil record, which often cannot distinguish a year from a century or a century from a millennium, it can look frighteningly instantaneous. Imagine standing back from a painting and only seeing the broad strokes. Fine lines blur together. Individual brush marks vanish. You notice instead the edges where colors change sharply. The geological record of the Permian-Triassic boundary is like that, a sharp edge where one world gives way to another. The temptation is to picture that edge as a single catastrophic day. It probably was not, but it might not have been many generations either. One way to visualize what happened is to think in terms of thresholds, tipping points. You can heat a pot of water on a stove for a long time, and very little seems to happen. The water gets warmer, maybe a few small bubbles appear at the bottom. But once you pass a critical temperature, everything changes at once. Vigorous boiling, rolling convection, steam rushing off the surface. The heat was building the whole time. The boiling looked sudden only because the system crossed a threshold. Climate and oceans behave in similar ways. They accumulate stress quietly, then reorganize abruptly. By the time we reach the very end of the period, the planet has already been pushed hard. Greenhouse gases have raised global temperatures. Ocean waters have absorbed carbon, becoming more acidic. Deep basins, as we've seen, are losing oxygens and turning anoxic and even. But for a while, life adjusts. Some lineages shift their ranges, others shrink in size, breed faster, or change their diets. Ecosystems rearrange, but do not fully collapse. There is still enough oxygen in enough places, enough habitable refuge, enough resilience. Then in some regions, in some critical interval near the boundary, the system goes past a point of no easy return. We can't rewind and watch it in real time, but we can sketch a plausible cascade, keeping 24 hours as a metaphor, a countdown, not a stopwatch. Hour 1 in this metaphor is not a literal hour. It is the moment conditions finally stack in the worst possible way. A new surge of Siberian eruptions accelerates greenhouse gas release. Temperatures tick a little higher, weather patterns already unstable lurch again, heat waves intensify on land. Rain switches from erratic to deeply unreliable in key regions. R3 warmth at the surface ocean boosts stratification. Warm, buoyant surface waters sit more stubbornly on top of cooler, denser, deep waters. Mixing slows. The little oxygen that had been trickling down into the depth slows with it. In coastal seas, rivers supercharged by erosion from dying fire-cargoed landscapes deliver a final strong pulse of nutrients and organic matter. Blooms of plankton flare across continental shells. They live briefly then sink, feeding microbial respiration in waters that were already oxygen poor. Hour 6. In many basins, the balance tips. Oxygen consumption by microbes overtakes oxygen supply. Deep waters flip from low oxygen to no oxygen at certain redox boundaries where just enough sulfur is available. Eusenia expands. Hydrogen sulfide spreads farther up from the seafloor, first poisoning benthic communities, then nibbling into midwater habitats. Animals living in these waters do not die all at once. Some can flee, some tolerate low oxygen. But as the hypoxic zones expand, both vertically and horizontally, options narrow. Islands of survivable water shrink and drift. Hour 9. Feedbacks intensify. As more organic matter decomposes without oxygen, more nutrients are regenerated and stirred back into the shallow ocean, fueling yet more blooms, yet more decay. In some models and proxy records, this transition from stressed but functioning to repeatedly collapsed oxygen conditions can be surprisingly quick, on the order of centuries or less. From the perspective of a long-lived tree that is a handful of lifetimes, from the perspective of a stratigraphic section, it may compress into a smear of black shale, a few cm thick. Our 12 reefs, which had already been weakened by warming and acidification, reach their collective breaking point. Many reef-building species of brachiopods and corals disappear from the record nearly together. Shelly communities on continental shelves thin abruptly. Diversity curves, based on carefully sampled fossil assemblages, show steep drops that within their resolution look almost vertical. On land, heat and drought compounded by soil loss and fire push plant communities to their own tipping points. In pollen and spore records, diverse assemblages of woody species give way to simpler floras dominated by opportunistic fast-growing types. In some sections, this shift aligns closely with the marine extinction horizon, suggesting that both realms experience their sharpest declines in roughly the same interval. Hour 15, with plant cover reduced and fragmented, and waterways choked with sediment, large herbivores, already stressed, cross their own thresholds. Reproductive rates can no longer keep up with mortality. Populations don't just decline slowly, they crash. The fossil record on land is much patchier than in the sea. We do not see individual herds vanish. We see gaps, fewer kinds of bones, fewer large skeletons, an interruption in the continuity of certain lineages across the boundary. In some basins, there is a literal erosional surface, a physical break in deposition right where we most want continuous information. To us, that can look like entire faunas dropping out in one instant. Hour 18. Predators that depended on those herbivores lose too mu. Che prey, the biggest, slowest reproducing forms, are hit hardest. Apex gorgonoptions, some of the most fearsome land carnivores of the Permian, do not reappear in Triassic rocks. In their place we find smaller, more generalized survivors and new lineages beginning to radiate. At this point in our metaphorical day, the core architecture of ecosystems, who eats whom, who shelters where, who engineers the habitat, has been rearranged beyond quick repair. The old networks are gone. Hour 21. In the oceans, the mismatch between survivors and their altered world becomes stark. Many specialized, slow-breeding, heavily calcified animals are gone. In their place, the early Triassic record shows disaster taxa, small, hardy, opportunistic organisms that can endure repeated oxygen crashes and chemical swings. For a stretch of time after the extinction peak, diversity remains low and communities are dominated by a few resilient forms. All of this may have played out over a few tens of thousands of years, perhaps with regional variation and multiple pulses. That is slow enough for individual organisms to live entire lives, raise young, and never know anything else. It is fast enough that in the rocks it compresses into a razor-thin boundary, a subtle shift in color or texture, a change in fossil content between one handspan and the next. This is the paradox of the 24 hours idea. To the biosphere, the Permian was generations of struggle with moments of acute crisis layered on background stress. To our instruments, it often appears as an almost singular break, a boundary that in some sections might represent only a few thousand years or even less of accumulated sediment. Our tools have limits. Fossil assemblages are time-averaged. Shells and bones from many years, even centuries, can be smeared together in a single bed. Radiometric dates have uncertainties measured in tens of thousands of years at these ages. Even the most finely laminated shells often cannot tell us whether two extinction events separated by, say, 50 years would show up as distinct layers. So when we see a horizon where many species vanish between one bed and the next, it does not prove that they all died on the same afternoon. It tells us that within the resolution of our record, they disappeared during a single relatively brief episode. That is what near instant means here. Not a human instant, but a geological one. A final steep descent at the end of a long downward slope. Still, the question remains, why did some lineages topple over that cliff while others found footholds? Why did certain plants, certain burrowing animals, certain small, fast-breeding marine invertebrates manage to ride out conditions that erased sprawling forests, massive herbivores, and elaborate reef ecosystems? To answer that, we have to step past the boundary line and look carefully at the pattern of survival on the other side, who vanished completely, who squeaked through in tiny numbers, and who, despite everything, was poised to inherit the altered Earth. Step across that boundary in your mind. On one side, late Permian seas crowded with architectures of life, thick branching reefs, layered shell beds, forests of chinoids waving in slow currents. On land, tangled plant communities, big-bodied herbivores, saber-toothed predators stalking floodplains. On the other side, much of that is gone. The Permian extinction did not erase everything, but it came closer than any other known event. In the oceans, estimates of species loss often hover around 80 to 90%. On land, many studies suggest that large vertebrate lineages suffered comparably severe blows. Those numbers, as we'll see, are approximations. The pattern is clearer than the exact total. A world suddenly thinned, simplified, and quiet. In the sea, the most visible victims were the reef builders. For tens of millions of years before the crisis, late Permian reefs had been intricate collaborations between organisms like ruggos and tabulate corals, sponge-like stromatophoids, and a variety of shell invertebrates. They built towering three-dimensional habitats full of nooks and ledges hosting complex communities of fish, mollusks, anaderms, and countless small creatures that never fossilized across the Permian-Triassic boundary. Those classic reef systems disintegrate. Coral groups that had dominated Paleozoic seas disappear entirely. Reef-building brachiopods, those lampshell animals that once carpeted continental shelves, collapse as well. Many types of heavily calcified organisms, from certain snails and clams to some crinoids and biozoans, either vanish or are reduced to a shadow of their former diversity. Shelly groups that depended on stable, well-oxygenated, relatively alkaline waters paid a particularly high price. The combination of warming, acidification, and expanding anoxia struck directly at the foundations of their way of life, their skeletons, and their need for oxygen-rich water. On land, a parallel tragedy unfolded. Before the boundary, Parian continents were home to a variety of synapsids, the mammal-like reptiles that, in a distant future, would give rise to true mammals. Some were massive herbivores with barrel chests, designed to process tough plant material. Others were formidable predators with deep jaws and blade-like teeth. Alongside them lived large amphibians, haunting swamps and river margins, growing to lengths that rivaled small crocodiles. Many of these lineages do not make it across. The fossil record shows a sharp drop in large specialized herbivores and apex predators. Groups that had dominated entire continents for tens of millions of years are truncated abruptly. Their last representatives are found below the boundary, and then above it only a few small generalized synapsids remain, along with more modest amphibian forms. Plant communities change too. In many regions, diverse forests of seed ferns, cordadolian trees, and other late Parian groups give way to more monotonous assemblages of hardy, fast-reproducing plants, often dominated by species that disperse quickly and tolerate disturbed, nutrient-poor soils. It is tempting to view this as simple bad luck, a roll of the dice on a planet in turmoil. But when paleontologists and ecologists look closely, a pattern emerges. The extinction was not entirely random. Certain traits seem to have offered a better chance of squeaking through on both land and sea. Small body size helped. Small animals need less food. They reach reproductive age faster. Their populations can recover more quickly after a bad year or two. In a world where resources fluctuate wildly, being able to bounce back matters. Many of the survivors were also ecological generalists. They were not picky about a narrow type of prey, a specific water depth, or a single kind of plant. They could shift diets, switch habitats, and exploit whatever remained. In the oceans, that often meant scavengers, deposit feeders, and opportunistic grazers. On land, it meant animals that could browse a variety of plants, or hunt many different kinds of small prey. Another common thread was a lifestyle buffered from the very worst surface conditions. Burrowing animals, both marine and terrestrial, appear disproportionately among survivors. Creatures that lived in burrows, root networks, or sediment layers could retreat from extremes of heat, cold, and toxic air. Underground, temperatures fluctuate less. Moisture is more stable. In the sea, animals that lived within the sediment or in microhabitats close to the seafloor sometimes found pockets of tolerable oxygen. The overlying water turned hostile. Tolerance to low oxygen became a decisive advantage. Some invertebrates can slow their metabolism dramatically, enduring extended periods of hypoxia. Others possess specialized respiratory structures or biochemical pathways that let them function with less oxygen than their competitors. These are the kinds of lineages that we see reappearing above the boundary, while strictly oxygen-hungry groups vanish or linger only in rare refuse. In this sense, the Nerian crisis acted like a filter. Big, slow-breeding, highly specialized animals, especially those that built heavy shells or required stable, oxygen-rich environments, were far more likely to fall through that filter. Small, fast-breeding, generalist and tolerant forms were more likely to be caught and carried forward. The communities that appear in the earliest Triassic rocks reflect this harsh selection. Paleontologists sometimes call them disaster communities. These are ecosystems dominated by a few hardy species that can colonize devastated habitats quickly. In the oceans, that often meant certain valves, small gastropods, and thin-shelled or even shellless forms that did not need much carbonate to build their bodies. In some basins, simple microbial mats and stromatolites, layered structures built by microbes, spread again over seafloors that had once supported lush reefs, reclaiming space that more complex animals could no longer hold. On land, disaster floras frequently feature spore-rich plants and pioneer species. In pollen and spore records, you can see spikes of certain hardy taxa that thrive in open, eroded, frequently burned landscapes. Herbivore communities simplify to a few resilient synapsids and small amphibians. Predators are smaller, more generalized, less specialized on a single kind of large prey. Food webs in these disaster phases are short, where late Parian ecosystems might have had several steps. Ecosystems might have had several steps from primary producers to apex predators, herbivores of various sizes, mid-level predators, scavengers, and specialists. The earliest Triachis often shows just 2 or 3 tiers: plants to small herbivores to small predators, detritus to opportunistic scavengers. This simplification makes recovery fragile. With only a few dominant species at each level, any further disturbance, another warming pulse, another oxygen crash, another drought can topple the whole structure. There is little redundancy, few backup players if one key species falters. That may be one reason why, even after the main extinction, pulse life does not rebound quickly. For millions of years into the early Triassic, many regions show signs of repeated setbacks, continued anoxia in the oceans, continued environmental stress on land, and communities that struggle to gain complexity. When scientists try to quantify the magnitude of the toll, they run into another challenge. Different methods yield somewhat different numbers. Sometimes researchers count genera. Sometimes they focus on species. Some datasets are global, others are regional. Marine fossils are generally more abundant and better preserved than those on land, so estimates for ocean losses are usually more precise than for terrestrial ones. Habitat matters too. Shallow shelf seas, deep basins, coastal lagoons, and open ocean environments each have their own preservation quirks and sampling histories. A group that looks nearly wiped out in one setting might have survived in small pockets elsewhere, only to be detected later through more detailed sampling or new fossil sites. On land, erosion and gaps in the rock record make things even fuzzier. Whole time intervals can be missing in some basins, cut out by rivers or never deposited at all. It can look like abrupt disappearance when in Rhea. Lightier lineage may have persisted a little longer, somewhere else, before finally dwindling. This is why published estimates for the Empyrean extinction magnitude often come with ranges and careful language, up to 90% of marine species, or on the order of 3/4 of known taxa. The exact percentage is less important than the consistent picture they paint. A biosphere profoundly thinned, a planet where complexity had been knocked down to something much more austere. If you imagine walking along the shoreline a few 100,000 years after the boundary, you would not see a lifeless world. The sea would still move, waves would still break, small shells would still wash up. There would be fish, invertebrates, algae, and microbes doing what life has always done, exploiting every possible niche, but compared with the rich, layered communities of the late Permian, it would feel sparse. Fewer kinds of shells underfoot, reefs, if present at all, low and simple, on nearby hills, fewer tall trees, more bare soil, more opportunistic plants clinging to unstable ground, fewer large animals moving across the landscape, longer stretches of quiet between encounters. This is the emotional signature of the Empyrean toll, not just the drama of extinction, but the subdued emptiness that follows, a long interval where the echoes of a once crowded world linger in the rocks while the survivors, small, tough, adaptable, begin slowly and unevenly to assemble new ways of living. In that emptiness, the stage is cleared for what comes next. New experiments, new lineages, new combinations of traits that will over tens of millions of years reshape land and sea. But before we follow those survivors into the strange, harsh early Triassic, there is another layer to the story, possible extra triggers and amplifiers that may have made an already terrible crisis even worse. When scientists see a catastrophe this large in the rock record, they start looking for every possible accomplice. Volcanism on the scale of the Siberian traps can on its own drive enormous environmental change. But when you line up all the clues, the rapid temperature spikes, the strange chemical fingerprints, the repeated aftershocks, it starts to look less like a single weapon attack and more like a chain reaction. So researchers have gone hunting for other suspects. Impacts, methane, microbes. None of them replaces the Siberian traps, but each could have turned a grave situation into something even worse. Begin with the most dramatic possibility, something from space. For other mass extinctions, the smoking gun is obvious. At the end of the Cretaceous, the impact that finished off the non-avian dinosaurs left a clear crater at Chicxulub, a global layer of iridium-rich dust and shattered minerals that only form under extreme pressures. The story there is hard to argue with. For the Empyrean, the evidence is murkier. Some researchers have reported tiny spherules, little glassy droplets in boundary layers at a few sites. Others have described shocked minerals or chemical anomalies that could in principle hint at an extraterrestrial impact. There are even candidate structures on Earth's surface that have been proposed as highly eroded, very ancient craters. But each line of evidence has problems. Those spherules can also form from volcanic explosions. Shock-like features in minerals can be mimicked by intense tectonic deformation. Candidate craters often turn out on closer inspection to be unrelated basins or to have ages that do not quite fit the extinction. And there is no globally consistent razor-thin layer of impact dust at the Permian-Triassic boundary the way there is at the end of the Cretaceous. No single crater that almost all workers agree on. No single smoking gun layer that screams one bad day. Third, it does not rule an impact out entirely. The Earth's surface is dynamic. Late Permian and early Triassic rocks have been buried, metamorphosis, and eroded. A large crater could have been largely destroyed. A smaller impact, or even several, might have left only subtle signatures, easily blurred by the noise of intense volcanism. So the idea persists. Perhaps somewhere in that long crisis, something big fell from the sky. If it did, it would have landed in a world already pushed to the edge. In that sense, an impact, if it occurred, would be an amplifier, not the main engine. It might have triggered wildfires, injected dust into the atmosphere, or added a brief pulse of acid rain to an environment already struggling with those same stresses from volcanic activity. But when scientists weigh the evidence today, most see the balance still tilted heavily toward earthbound forces. The Siberian traps and the feedbacks they unleashed remain center stage. One of the most potent of those feedbacks involves methane. Carbon dioxide from volcanic eruptions warms the planet. As temperatures rise, they can disturb reservoirs of carbon that had been stable for millions of years. One such reservoir is frozen methane. On many continental margins under the seafloor, methane is trapped within an icy lattice of water molecules. These methane hydrates are stable only under a narrow band of temperatures and pressures. Warm the water above them enough, or change the pressure, and they can begin to destabilize. Release is not always dramatic. It can be slow, a long exhale, but under the right conditions, it can become rapid, even catastrophic, with vast amounts of methane bubbling up through sediments into the ocean and eventually into the atmosphere. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas. Molecule for molecule over short time scales, it traps heat far more effectively than carbon dioxide. A large sudden release could crank up global temperatures far beyond what CO2 alone would do. When geochemists study the carbon isotopes in rocks across the Permian-Triassic boundary, they see sharp negative excursions, sudden shifts indicating a major influx of light carbon with a lower ratio of the heavier isotope, 13C. Methane from hydrates is very light in this sense. Thermogenetically generated methane formed when buried organic matter is heated deep underground is also light. This has led to scenarios in which the Siberian traps begin the warming, and methane keeps it going. One possibility focuses on shallow marine hydrates. As oceans warmed, these icy deposits could have started to melt, releasing methane into the water column. Some would have been oxidized to CO2 in the ocean, adding to acidification. Some might have escaped into the atmosphere, intensifying the greenhouse effect. Another possibility points directly back to the Siberian traps region itself. As magma from the Siberian eruptions rose through thick piles of sedimentary rocks, rich in organic material, coal seams, black shells, evaporates, it would have baked them, cracking complex molecules into lighter hydrocarbons, methane, CO2 and other gases. These thermogenic emissions could have been enormous, comparable in climate impact to the volcanic gases themselves. In both scenarios, methane is not the match, it is the accelerant. A world already stressed by heat anoxia and acidification suddenly receives an extra pulse of warming potential. Temperature climbs more quickly. Ocean circulation patterns already weakened falter further. The habitable zones in the sea contract. On land, heat waves and droughts intensify. Those same environmental changes open the door for another kind of accomplice, one that leaves no crater and no lava field, but a distinctive chemical trail. Microbes, life's smallest players, have an outsized role in shaping planetary chemistry. In healthy oceans, microbial communities cycle nutrients, recycle organic matter, and help maintain a balance between oxygen production and consumption. But change the temperature, stir in huge amounts of nutrients from weathering rocks and dying organisms, strip oxygen from deep waters, and you can tip that balance. Different microbes begin to dominate. Across many Triassic sections, geochemists detect signs of expanded activity by certain sulfur-cycling bacteria. These include microbes that thrive in low oxygen or oxygen-free waters where sulfate is abundant. They respire not with oxygen but with sulfate-producing hydrogen sulfide, a toxic gas with the smell of rotten eggs. In modern environments, dense blooms of such bacteria form in stagnant basins and eukaryotic sulfidic layers. The markers they leave, specific molecules preserved in sediments, distinctive sulfur isotope patterns, suggest that in some regions, eugenic conditions may have reached not only the deep ocean, but crept into shallower waters where many animals lived. If hydrogen sulfide accumulated in bottom waters and periodically upwelled toward the surface, it would have been deadly for many marine organisms. Some models even explore the possibility that under extreme conditions, hydrogen sulfide could have escaped into the atmosphere, damaging the ozone layer and stressing terrestrial life. Whether or not the most extreme versions of that scenario played out globally, the direction of the feedback is clear. Warming and nutrient input encourage microbial blooms. Those blooms consume oxygen, deepen anoxia, and produce toxic byproducts. Anoxia and toxins kill more complex life, adding more organic matter to the system, feeding further microbial growth. Once this loop is established, in an already stressed ocean, it is hard to break. In this way, microbes become active participants in the extinction, not passive observers. It is easy to imagine each of these suspects, impacts, methane bursts, microbial blooms, as competing explanations. In practice, many researchers now see them as layered. The Siberian traps supply long-term forcing CO2, SO2, aerosols, and direct heating of organic-rich rocks. That forcing triggers warming, acid rain, changes in weathering, and a shifting hydrological cycle. Those in turn destabilize the methane reservoirs and fertilize coastal waters with nutrients. Methane intensifies the warming, pushing climates past additional thresholds. The oceans become more stratified, deep waters more stagnant, microbes adapted to low oxygen bloom, reshaping biogeochemical cycles in ways that make the water column still more hostile to complex life. Any possible impacts during this time would have landed in the middle of this slow-motion crisis, more likely adding sharp jolts than defining the entire trajectory. From a distance of 252 million years, it can feel frustrating that we cannot point to a single culprit with the clarity of the dinosaur-killing impact. But that frustration says more about our desire for neat stories than about how Earth systems work. In reality, catastrophes are often layered. One process opens doors for others. Feedbacks multiply. Local events cascade into global consequences. The way scientists untangle this is itself part of the story. Over the past few decades, radiometric dating has become more precise. UP dates on zircon crystals in volcanic ash beds have narrowed the timing of eruptions and extinction pulses from millions of years to, in some cases, tens of thousands. New geochemical proxies based on isotopes of carbon, sulfur, iron, and other elements have given finer views of ocean oxygen levels, temperatures, and biological productivity. Each new dataset is like another flashlight beam in a dark, crowded room. Sometimes it highlights apparent contradictions. A section where anoxia seems delayed, a region where warming appears earlier than expected, a place where recovery begins sooner. These differences drive debate. Teams propose alternative sequences. Perhaps methane release peaked here. Perhaps volcanic output surged there. Perhaps circulation patterns differed between basins. Over time, as more sites are dated, more cores are drilled, and more proxies are measured, a picture emerges that is not perfectly uniform, but consistent in its broad strokes. A long volcanic episode, superimposed pulses of warming, episodes of severe widespread anoxia, evidence in certain intervals and places for microbial dominance and possible methane involvement. Scientific debate in this view is not a sign that we know nothing. It is a sign that we're filling in details around a set of patterns that most workers now recognize. What matters for the next part of the story is that, however the exact combination of triggers and amplifiers is arranged, the outcome is the same. By the time the dust settles, and the lava cools, and the methane is oxidized and microbial blooms run their course, the world that remains is thinly stocked and unstable. The extinction itself is only the first act. In the early Triassic, the survivors inherit a planet still under the influence of lingering volcanism, with strange oceans, altered atmospheres, and repeated environmental aftershocks. Their challenge is not only to repopulate empty niches, but to do so in a world that keeps changing under their feet. Step with them now into that aftermath, a dead Earth that is not truly dead, but haunted by the memory of what it has lost, and by the forces that are still not entirely done with it. For a moment after the peak of the crisis, it might have seemed as if things were calming down. The worst of the Siberian eruptions had passed, the most intense pulses of warming and ocean suffocation had already swept through. In the rock record, the line that marks the Paran-Triac boundary is razor-sharp. Above it, you might expect to see a clean upward curve, life bouncing back, ecosystems rebuilding, diversity climbing steadily towards something like normal. That is not what the rocks show. Instead, the early Triassic looks like a world trying and failing. Or recover, a planet stuck in a kind of ecological aftershock. Geologists talk about this interval as one of protracted recovery. For tens of millions of years after the main extinction pulse, global diversity stays low. Many groups barely hang on. Communities that do form are fragile, easily knocked down by each new disturbance. It is as if the extinction was not a single event, but a series of blows, spaced just far enough apart that nothing complex can stand up and stay standing. On land, this is written in the simplest of ways. The first Triassic plant communities in many regions are dominated not by diverse forests, but by a few hardy pioneers. In some places, the fossil record is full of ferns and seed ferns, plants that are good at colonizing disturbed ground. In others, there are vast stretches where even those are rare, and the most common plant fossils are just wind-blown spores, scattered and sparse. Tree-sized plants, where they appear, are often of limited variety. The intricate multi-layered forests of the late Permian, tall canopy trees, understory shrubs, climbing vines, rich mossy floors are mostly gone. What replaces them at first is more like scrub, open, patchy, vulnerable to fire and drought. Animals reflect that simplicity. The great Permian synapsids with their elaborate tooth patterns and specialized jaws mostly disappear. In their place come a few lineages of survivors that spread widely but without the same level of ecological complexity. Many assemblages are dominated by small to medium-sized forms that look generalized. Not extreme predators, not extreme herbivores, but something in between. It is a world with fewer roles to play, fewer strategies, fewer ways to make a living. In the oceans, the picture is even starker. Before the extinction, Permian seas supported spectacular reef systems. Not coral reefs as we know them, but vast carbonate struck. Tours built by sponges, algae, and other reef-building organisms. These frameworks created nooks and crannies, protected lagoons, and complex three-dimensional habitats where countless species could specialize. The extinction wipes most of that away. Across the Paran-Triassic boundary, those reef builders merely vanish. In the earliest Triassic, there are long stretches where true reefs are essentially absent. Instead, much of the shallow seafloor is covered in microbial mats, slimy carpets of bacteria and algae that thrive in conditions too harsh for more delicate animals. These microbial lights show up as thick-layered limestones in the rock record. They tell a quiet story that in many coastal environments the engineers of complexity are gone. The scaffolding that once supported diverse communities has collapsed and simple microbial communities have rushed in to occupy the bare surfaces. Without reefs, the nearshore ocean becomes more monotonous. Fewer hiding places, fewer gradients of light and current, fewer microhabitats. Diversity struggles to increase when the physical stage itself has been flattened. Underlying this is a deeper problem. The environment refuses to settle. Even after the biggest eruptions end, the climate in the early Triassic is not stable. Temperature reconstruction suggests that global warmth remains extreme. In some models, equatorial regions may have been so hot and humid at times that they approach the upper limits for large animals' comfort. On top of that baseline heat, there are pulses. Geochemical records show repeated swings in carbon isotopes, hints of additional injections of greenhouse gases, or shifts in how carbon is cycled. These swings are often accompanied by renewed signs of ocean anoxia, intervals when deep waters lose oxygen again, sometimes spreading toward the surface. Imagine trying to rebuild an ecosystem on a coastline. Every so often the sea turns hostile again. Oxygen drops, toxic compounds from the deep rise up. Animals that are just begun to recolonize are hit with another wave of stress. It is not that life cannot survive this. Some lineages do quite well, but it is hard to build complexity when the ground and the water keep shifting beneath you. Part of the delay in recovery comes from the time it takes for certain key structures to return. Reefs, for instance, are not simple. They are communities built on communities. A single coral or sponge cannot construct a barrier reef overnight. You need generations of builders, stable conditions for skeletons to accumulate, the right chemistry in the water, and a supporting cast of grazers and filter feeders to keep the system from clogging. After the Empyrean extinction, many of the original reef-building groups are gone or severely reduced. New architects will eventually evolve. Different kinds of corals, different symbiosis, but that innovation takes time. Until it happens, the oceans lack the intricate architecture that once supported immense biodiversity. On land, soils face a similar challenge. Healthy, thick soils do not appear instantly. They are co-created by plants, fungi, microbes, and burrowing animals over thousands to millions of years. Roots cracks and hold sediments in place. Fungi trade nutrients with plants. Earthworms and other invertebrates mix organic matter into mineral grains. In the immediate aftermath of the extinction, with forests gone or reduced, that slow machinery is damaged. In many basins, early Triassic sediments show signs of intense erosion. Coarse, poorly sorted layers washed in by floods, stacked one atop another. River channels shift frequently. Slopes are bare, easily stripped by rain. It takes the return of more substantial vegetation, trees with deep root systems, plant communities able to cover large areas to stabilize landscapes again. Until then, soils remain thin, easily disturbed, and prone to being swept away before they can mature. Rivers, too, go through a phase of wildness. In late Paran rocks, geologists often find evidence of meandering rivers, channels that snake across floodplains bounded by stable banks, held together by roots and cohesive soils. These systems tend to spread their sediments gently, building broad, fertile plains. In early Triassic deposits, the style changes in many regions. Rivers become more braided, multiple shallow channels, weaving around gravel bars, frequently rearranged by floods. This is what happens when there is lots of loose sediment and not much vegetation to contain it. Only later in the Triassic, as plant cover improves and soils thicken, do meandering systems become more common again. Water courses settle into more predictable paths. Floodplains stabilize. That stability, in turn, creates reliable habitats where animals and plants can specialize and diversify. Through all of this, some survivors quietly begin to set the stage for new worlds. Certain groups of barbs and gastropods endure the crisis, and in the early Triassic expand into niches, left empty by more sensitive shell builders. Their simple, robust designs and flexible feeding habits give them an edge in unstable environments among vertebrates. Early relatives of modern lizards and erosaurs, distant kin of crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs, start to appear and diversify. At first, they are small players in simple ecosystems, but their basic body plans prove adaptable. As the world gradually calms, they're in position to take advantage. Marine reptiles, too, emerge from among the survivors. Ichthyosaurs and other groups evolve from land-dwelling ancestors that return to the sea. In the early Triassic, their fossils are still relatively rare and primitive. By the Middle and Late Triassic, after ecosystems have had more time to stabilize, they will become dominant open ocean predators. In this way, the early Triassic is less a time of flourishing than a time of seeding. Lineages that will later define entire eras are present, but not yet at their peak. They are like saplings on a scraped, clean hillside, biding their time, slowly putting down roots while storms continue to pass overhead. Eventually, the pulses of environmental stress become less frequent and less severe. Volcanic activity in Siberia wanes. The carbon cycle, knocked violently off balance, begins to find a new equilibrium. Weathering of freshly exposed rocks draws some CO2 out of the atmosphere. Ocean circulation patterns adjust. Anoxia retreats from some basins, though it may linger in others for a long time. With fewer shocks, ecosystems are finally able to accumulate complexity. Reef-like structures reappear, first in modest forms, then more elaborate. Forests recover in patches, then spread, weaving together landscapes that had been fragmented. Animals evolve new ways of feeding, moving, and interacting. Food webs add tiers. From the vantage point of the late Triassic, the early Triassic, dead Earth is just a dim memory, a strange, harsh plateau between two very different worlds. But in the rocks, its signature remains. Thin, low-diversity microbial mats where reefs once stood, braided rivers and eroded hills, slopes, repeated chemical hints of a planet that could not quite decide on a new normal. Seen this way, the Permian-Triassic extinction is not only about a day or a decade or even 100,000 years of crisis. It is about how long it takes for a planet to rebuild after its basic systems have been pushed past their usual limits. Recovery does come. The biosphere, given time, finds new forms, new architectures, new strategies. The world that emerges is not a replica of what was lost, but something entirely different. New lineages, new forests, new seas. Earth, in other words, has a way of resetting. Not gently, not with any guarantee for particular species or particular ways of life, but thoroughly. When we look out at modern landscapes and oceans, we are seeing the distant transformed descendants of those early Triassic survivors living on a planet that has been remade many times since. The rocks that hold the story of that dead Earth lie quietly beneath our feet, carrying a reminder written in minerals and fossils, that even after the worst day and the long, difficult days that follow, the planet continues, not as it was, but as something new. In the end, the story of the Permian extinction comes down to a chain reaction. It begins with rock and fire, an area of volcanism so vast that it poured out lava and gas for hundreds of thousands of years, building the Siberian traps kilometer thick. Those eruptions did not just make mountains of basalt, they bled greenhouse gases into the air. CO2 and methane in quantities that are hard to visualize, enough to push a stable, familiar climate into something stranger. The atmosphere warmed, not gently, not in the slow background way of distant geological shifts, but in sharp steps. Each major pulse of eruptions added another shove. The oceans absorbed much of that extra carbon, becoming more acidic. Shell builders struggled, reef faltered. As temperatures climbed, circulation in the seas changed. Warm surface waters became reluctant to mix downward. Deep basins lost oxygen, and toxic zones spread first in pockets, then across entire regions. In some places, toxic compounds like hydrogen sulfide may have seeped upward from the suffocating depths. Land felt the shock as well. Hotter, drier conditions in many interior regions. Forests stressed by heat, drought, acid rain, wildfire, more frequent ash and soot darkening skies, soils stripped from hillsides. The systems that had quietly cycled carbon and nutrients for millions of years broke rhythm. None of these pieces by themselves guaranteed catastrophe, but together they formed a cascade. Volcanism, warming, acidification, oxygen loss, habitat collapse. Food webs stretched, began to fray. Remove enough threads, and the net fails all at once. When scientists talk about the 24 hours in which 75% of a life might vanish, they are not claiming that every last species disappeared between one sunrise and the next. They're using a clock as a metaphor for how a slow building pressure can at a certain point release in what feels like an instant. Imagine compressing hundreds of thousands of years into a single day. In the morning, ecosystems are stressed, but functioning. By afternoon, more species are gone. Niches are empty. Recovery is already looking harder. And then, sometime just after midnight, a threshold is crossed. Critical parts of the system fail together. Reefs, forests, shallow seas, coastal plains, they all experience their own tipping points. To the creatures living through it, the worst of it would have felt brutally sudden. What the rocks tell us is that Earth can be patient for a long time and then change very quickly. They also tell us something quieter. Long after those animals and plants were gone, long after their soft tissues decayed and their bones were buried, the sediments kept accumulating. Ash fell and became thin, dark layers. Chemical signatures of warm oxygen, poor seas, were locked into tiny mineral grains. Microbial mats left their wrinkled textures in limestone. Today, when geologists split those rocks, the story is still there, not in words, but in patterns of carbon isotopes, in sudden disappearances of fossils, in the sharp boundary that marks the worst day and the long struggle after. Rocks remember even when life cannot. If you're listening to this in the quiet of the night, somewhere far from Siberia, far from the ancient shoreline of the Panthalassic Ocean, watching, you are in a small way listening to those rocks, to their record of how our planet behaved when pushed hard, and how it eventually found a new balance. It can be an unsettling story. It is also a strangely calming one, because it reminds us that Earth is not fragile in the way individual species are. It changes sometimes abruptly, sometimes with consequences that ripple for tens of millions of years. But after each crisis, new worlds emerge, new forests, new reefs, new ways of being alive. We live in one of those later worlds, built on the ruins of many earlier ones. Our own species' future is not guaranteed, and our choices matter. Yet the deep time perspective carried in the rocks can invite a different kind of stillness, the sense of resting for a moment inside a story that is vast, intricate, and ongoing. If you've made it this far, and you'd like more journeys into these buried chapters of Earth's past, you can gently tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. It helps this little corner of sleepy history reach more ears, and if you feel like sharing, you're welcome to tell us where you're listening from and what time it is there as you drift towards sleep. It's always a quiet wonder to imagine this same story unfolding in many rooms and many time zones at once. If tonight's tale has stirred your curiosity about other prehistoric secrets, lost worlds, strange creatures, forgotten disasters, you can find more at sleepytimehistory.com, including a book that gathers these hidden episodes into one place, written to be read at a slow, drowsy pace. For now, you can let the details of volcanic plateaus and ancient oceans fade. Somewhere beneath your feet, layers of rock are holding their own memories, pressed into place long before there were people to name them. The worst day, the long recovery, the turning of one age into another. They're all still there, patient and silent. You don't have to remember it all. The planet is doing that for you. All you need to do is breathe and rest and let the story settle like sediment into sleep. Heat, heat, heat.